Good afternoon, Bill. So here we are again for another podcast. So this is our third one today. And we've had two really interesting guests with a third interesting guest sitting opposite, ready to go. The rain stopped and it's still freezing. But anyway.
It is cold today, and you and I are both bachelors at the moment because our wives are away. So we had to scramble up heat up the pumpkin soup or whatever it was for lunch.
Very enjoyable.
That's right. Yes, it's been an interesting time, Mark, and during August you and I facilitated a workshop for Small Business Month in Victoria, which as a monthly program for the City of Geelong and the Chamber of Commerce, it's been very successful. And we heard at a session we went to this morning that they had over 70 events during that month, which was excellent. And ours was called Building a Better Business.
Yep.
And we had 30 business owners attend. And one of the interesting things was that we'd taken some lessons that we had learnt during our 60-odd podcasts and a few other sort of fundamental business issues. And the one that surprised me was when we put up the information about a SWOT analysis, I think only one hand went up in the room.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
And people, and I've had this before, where people said, "Oh, do you want to do that? You know, that's old style and all the rest of it." But wherever I go and in all the big corporations I've ever worked for, it's still a fundamental business tool that you should do.
And it's interesting. So a person that we won't name because that's unfair on them, but they were looking at moving commercial kitchens for their hospitality business. And I know that they actually sat down and did a SWOT analysis before they made a decision to make sure they were making the right decision. So it's interesting. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to use it and forget it. It means you can use it ongoing. So
it's one of those, instruments that I always use, and I've never forgotten it.
No. So, Bill,
Yep.
Who's today's guest?
Well, today is another interesting guest. All our guests are interesting. I'd like to introduce to our listeners Lyndal Box, who is the principal or the owner of LB Learning Solutions. And I did catch up with Lyndal the other day, and she's got another great small business story to tell.
So welcome, Lyndal.
Thank you very much.
So as we do, and you've listened to a couple of our podcasts, we start with the age-old question. Where did you go to primary school?
I went to Kangaroo Flat Primary School.
Kangaroo Flat?
Yeah, it's a good little name, isn't it? It's a suburban school just on the outskirts of Bendigo.
Okay, country.
Yeah, semi.
So why Bendigo? What was happening in Bendigo?
Well, my parents both had different reasons for being in Bendigo. They'd moved from Melbourne for different reasons, and both of them blue-collar workers. So my dad was a tyre fitter there, and my mum's parents owned a shop, and my mum then went to work at Woolies. So they met and married and decided to build their own house in Bendigo, and back in the day there were only about 2 jobs that you couldn't do yourself, and I think one of them was roof trusses. And there was one other thing that you couldn't do, and they did everything else themselves. It took them 5 years.
Built it all themselves.
And my mother still lives in that house today.
Wow. That's a good story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't do that today. There'd be too many regulations and planning permits.
That's right. Have you, Lyndal, have you ever added up how many houses you've lived in?
I have, and it's somewhere in the mid-20s.
Mark, have you ever done that?
I haven't, but I reckon I'd be probably close to that.
Liz and I have lived in 21 different houses since we got married.
Oh,
How's
wow.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting,
That's
isn't it?
either good or bad.
That is either good or bad.
And if your grandmother, did you say? Has lived in the same house?
My mother.
Oh, your
my
mother.
Yeah.
Well, that's an achievement. Right. Yeah.
So have the police not caught up with you yet then?
No.
Okay.
No, that's not.
Anyway, back to you, Lyndal. So primary school, then high school, where was that?
That was Golden Square High School, which
In
is
Bendigo?
it's now a flattened piece of land. But I went there from year 7 to 10, and then year 11 and 12 at Bendigo Senior High School, which was one of the government's pilot schools as a standalone year 11 and 12 school. It was one of the first ones, and all of the Bendigo regional schools fed into that school at the time. So
you feel a bit of an orphan when your school's demolished, don't you?
I did.
I went to a boarding school in England, and when I went back a few years ago, I went to have a look at it, and it's a housing estate, and I went, oh.
No, it's very confronting.
It is confronting.
Yeah.
And then from high school?
Yeah, so as soon as I finished high school, I hit the road. I couldn't wait to make tracks, and I went to Melbourne and I studied music at Melbourne. I deferred a year, my first year at University of Melbourne, because I thought I wanted to be a jazz star.
Oh, wow.
And that course was a combined music and education course, and I thought, no, I really want to be a jazz muso. So I deferred and I went to Box Hill TAFE for a year, and within that year I firmly decided that I did not want to be a jazz musician. And I ended up studying at University of Melbourne and became extremely passionate about learning.
Well, and so you're musical, obviously?
Yes, and I was a music teacher for 10 years. That was my first job.
And what instruments do you play?
Saxophone's my major. I don't play anymore though, jaw issues, but also piano.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
That's excellent. I've not met any saxophone players,
No,
I think.
I haven't either, to be quite honest. So what was the very first job you ever had?
Oh, well, that was back at high school. Mm-hmm. And since my mum worked at Woolies, it was a nice little inn.
There you go.
Yep. 14 years and 9 months, and I was straight in there.
How many times have we heard that?
We heard that. Woolies, Coles, they're all...
Whatever it was, Safeway in those days.
It was Safeway then.
Yep. Target, Kmart, they all take people in.
Mm.
So you finish uni...
Yep. And
no jazz musician?
No. I became a teacher, a secondary school music teacher, and I did that for 10 years.
And where were you teaching?
So my first job, back in the day, that it was around the time where a lot of Victorian teachers were made redundant. There were schools closed, and previously it had been very easy for music teachers to get jobs wherever they wanted. And really we weren't in the hard basket. I was still able to get a job, but I had to work 4 days a week at a school in Bendigo and 1 day a week in Kyneton. So that's how I made up my full-time work.
Yeah, okay.
That was my first year.
And did you enjoy teaching music? Was that...
Enormously, yes. Yeah, it was a great job, and I met some beautiful kids and some really passionate and went on to become musicians.
Well, I was going to ask you, has anyone famous come through your class that you could think of?
I don't know about famous, but certainly some of them have gone on and played in bands and done well for themselves.
That's cool, isn't it? That's very cool. So then what's transitioned you out of music? What led to the next step?
Well, it wasn't an altogether, one thing that made me decide. My husband and I had met and married as teachers, and he got to his 10-year anniversary at a school and earned long service leave and said, I can take my long service leave, 3 months worth, for 6 months at half pay. Why don't we travel? And I'd been teaching for 10 years by then, and the job that I had was a 12-month position. I thought, I'll just leave it. Let's just do that and let's do something different. And that changed everything for us. So we came home and said, it's time to do something new. And I ended up...
I hate to say it, Mark, but there's the tipping
there's
point.
Or sliding door moment, as I call it.
Every interview we've got, we go looking. We now deliberately look for it.
Yep.
What was the tipping point in your life, or the sliding door moment? That
what made you go
sent you
left
in
and
another
not right?
direction? So what happened?
So we came back and we said, we love travel so much. Why don't we give the travel industry a go? And we both ended up with jobs at Virgin Blue back then, which is now Virgin Australia. We did that for 3 years. And, of course, starting off there, I was just happy to work at the airport. But knowing that we both had education backgrounds, we quickly became trainers. And within a 3-year period, we were training people on how to drive the aero bridges and all sorts of wonderful and exciting things. So that was the beginning of working in business as such.
And did you have to write the training programs?
Yeah. I actually wrote the check-in manual for the Virgin site in Melbourne, which I think they took up nationally in the end. Yeah,
and it's still in place. Do you think
the service? It could be.
Or it's been taken over by a robot.
It could have.
AI has stepped in.
They've probably had quite a few changes in IT since then, but yeah.
And then what took you away from Virgin? What was the next step?
Well, it was hard to do shift work, and I got tired of that. And then I saw an advertisement for a job that it was advertised by a recruitment agency, and it didn't actually say what the company was, but the description of the job sounded really exciting, and it involved travel again. And I thought, I'll apply for this. And then I found out it was Armour Guard. And I thought, what on earth have I got myself into? Because this is men with guns, right? Security, cash in transit. And I thought, I'll just go to the interview anyway and see. And I really got a good feel for it, and I loved it. And I was the Southern Region Training Manager for a couple of years and then became their National Training Manager, and I learned to shoot. And I
You
did
might
my
need it
security.
in training.
You never know. I got my security licence. I met some wonderful people, and I've got some friends that I've retained ever since, and we regularly catch up. It was a wonderful opportunity.
So again, writing training programs.
Yep. Cash in transit things, a lot of it was secure. A lot of the things we signed confidentiality agreements around because there's a lot of things at stake when you're dealing with a lot of money like that. But yes, we worked on what the road crew did, what the people in the branch did, counting cash, the vehicles, all sorts of things.
That's cool. Actually, I'll digress slightly. I in my early days at working at Target in Liverpool in Sydney, the Armour Garden guys went on strike, and we still had to take our cash to the bank. And it was, let's do this cautiously. Yeah. So the first day we did it, we had a briefcase, and we had about $50,000 in cash in the briefcase, and two of us just sidled up the street walking, and the Target head office or state office had an armed undercover guy walking behind us. And we just had to be casual, and we walked into the bank and went up to the teller and opened the briefcase. And the bank was so angry at us because we'd brought this big pile of cash in. So then we had to work out a process and system to do it. But we really respected the Armour Guard guys after that.
Yeah, it's quite a dangerous job, really.
It is a dangerous job. And you don't realise how important... You think it's simple when they just turn up and take the money away. But we had a lot of respect for them after that. So sorry, I digress, but yeah.
Enjoying that digression.
Oh, so where were you living at that stage then?
In Melbourne.
Oh, you'd moved to Melbourne?
Yeah. So prior to that, we travelled a bit. We taught English in Lithuania and Poland and did all sorts of amazing things. But yeah, by then we were in Melbourne, and I stayed in Melbourne until about 7 years ago. So I worked at WorkSafe at Essendon Fields after that.
Yeah.
And then moved to Geelong because I'd heard about some very exciting and challenging things happening in the National Disability Insurance Agency, and I wanted to get into it.
Well, we're involved in that in some of our consulting, aren't we?
So let's just leap back slightly. English in Lithuania and Poland, how long was that for?
We lived in Lithuania for about 18 months, and we travelled on and off for a good while around that. So I think we had 5 consecutive winters. By the way, we travelled, and I wouldn't recommend that for anyone, especially when it's a Northern European winter. I'm coming back here after.
Now, Lyndal, have you recorded all of this and diarised it, as they would say, or these days in your computer? What's your record of what you've done in the past? Because it's a wide and varied experience.
It is.
Right.
Yeah, it's a bit haphazard, my record keeping on that, I'm afraid. I've got letters that I wrote to my family weekly while we travelled, so they're sort of nice.
That's cool.
Yeah, but no, I suppose LinkedIn's my record of the working bit.
We'll act as your agent. We'll go and find someone to write it all for you. But I'm serious, because that, like all of our podcasts, everyone has a story. And your story is not a normal story.
No.
Right? So it's anyway, we'll talk about that at another time. Yeah.
And what's Lithuania like to live in?
At the time, it only recently joined the European Union, so it was a tumultuous time. They hadn't long become independent from the Soviet Union. Lots of things going on, lots of issues. Lots of homelessness, people living in the sewers, and a lot of cash in hand arrangements.
Okay.
So it was challenging, but for me it was mostly challenging. My husband's a Lithuanian speaker.
Okay.
But we both taught English, and if he wasn't home, I was answering the phone. So I very quickly had to learn how to negotiate my way to have a conversation and maybe set up an appointment with people, and that was a very big immersive experience.
A great experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely great experience. Yeah, that's interesting. So into Geelong, NDIS.
Yep.
So what was your role there?
I started off in the learning and development team. And if you've had experiences with the NDIS, you'll understand that, a lot of what's happening is still being worked out. It's going to be a long process. So when I joined, it was so much in its early days that decisions were being made about what was to be trained often the day before it would happen. It was stressful, and it got a lot of people undone. And I did it for a while in that area and thought, this is not going to make any difference here. I can't do anything that feels like I'm making a difference, and I want to. And I found out about an area of the workplace that was involved in designing the operational procedures for staff. And I thought, I can do a difference there. I can make a difference there. So I joined their team, which was called Pathway Resources back then. I don't believe that team exists anymore. But in that team, I was responsible for participating in the Letters and Forms working group. So we designed the letters that were going out to staff. We designed all of the procedures that staff got, and we reworked how that was delivered to staff and the way it was addressed, looking at things like making sure it was in plain English and easily digestible, because everybody had ridiculous timeframes to roll things out and they didn't have time to read procedures properly. So we had to make it as streamlined, as user-friendly as possible, and being mindful that a large percentage of the population of the organisation are people with lived experience of disability. So we had to cater to their needs, and that's where my eyes were opened widest.
Okay.
Well, that's interesting when you say things were changing frequently, or still are, and I've got direct evidence of that, Mark, with two people who you know over the last 10 days who are heavily involved in providing services within, mostly under NDIS, and I've had exactly the same comment as you just made. The things are changing on the run, and it must be frustrating for people that are trying to manage the sort of ground level experience.
Frustrating for the clients.
Well, that as well, yes.
It's a super tough environment, and a lot of people, a lot of really passionate and wonderful experienced people have come and gone, and some are still there, and the ones who are still there I take my hat off to because their work is really tough, but they do it because they're passionate about it, and they want the disability sector, to be more functional. And while it has a long way to go, it has been a really big step forward to move away from the state model, the institutional-based model. And hopefully in years to come, we'll look back at this time and say it was worth it.
So, all right. So how did you leapfrog from there to now running your own LB Learning Solutions?
Well, I think it's fair to say I had a bit of a burnout at the NDIA, and I just went through that stage where my father died and a whole lot of things happened in my life, and I thought I just want to walk away from this and start something new that means something to me. Because when you lose someone that you love, it makes you question everything and what your priorities are. And I realised that my priorities and my passion have always been in learning, and particularly making sure that learning is something that everyone can access. And I'm talking about any type of minority, whether that's poverty, whether that's disability, whether that's age, anything at all. When we have an educated community, we have a thriving community. So with that, and with my experience in the disability sector, I thought I'm going to move into designing learning that caters to everyone. And sadly, I think there's a lot of learning out there that doesn't. And I know that there is, and then particularly in businesses and organisations where people are trying to roll things out very quickly.
And learning at all level, as you say, and Mark and I are great believers of the Gordon TAFE, and we've had a little bit to do with the hospitality school. But at this function we went to this morning, early today, there were 400 people there, so it was catered for, and it was at the Geelong Football Club, and I'll declare that. And I was talking to the venue manager afterwards and saying, how'd you handle that this morning? Because there were a couple of hiccups in the timing of the speaker, etc. And we were talking about the ability to find chefs who actually knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And the Gordon's got this magnificent training facility, but he said they are actually buying their fruit and vegetables from a company called Harvey's in Geelong, which is well known. They're sending it to Genu, which is a disability provider.
Yep.
They're cutting it all up, and then they're sending it back into the kitchens, because he said sometimes you can't even find a so-called chef that knows how to prepare food, that basic level. So you're quite right. We underestimate the importance of training, and of course then there's that issue in apprenticeships about the time, etc., etc. We all understand that.
Yeah.
But the two of us are actually continuous learners.
Yeah.
And it's so important. You just don't stop learning.
No. And
So,
it's a
all right,
passion.
so let's talk about your business today.
Yep.
You don't know me, and we've just met, and please try and explain exactly what your business does.
Yep.
Sorry, explain to our listeners.
Okay, so I'm a learning consultant, learning and performance, and I design learning programs for organisations that are absolutely tailored to them. And depending on what the organisation is will depend on what it looks like. So, for instance, I've recently been working with an autism provider, and they do great work where they work with young school leavers who are autistic, and they place them into work. First of all, looking at what the needs are, where the gaps are, what the workplaces need, what their support levels are, and what they require to know about what the learners bring with them, what the differences are between neurominorities and neurotypical environments, all that sort of thing, and then designing programs that work. So we work together. I co-designed with the experts in autism because I'm not an autism expert. I know a little bit, but I don't pretend to be an expert at all. And I will work towards creating workshops around communication, which is a need for them. Might not be a workshop if it's someone else, but they needed to do communication. Then we targeted tailored and individual coaching for these guys so that they had the support between the workshops and were able to practice what they'd learned. We did it over a period of time. We spaced out the learning so that it had some traction, and then worked with the people in the workplaces to make sure that they were ready and brought the people together and provided on-job coaching afterwards. So we really looked at a beginning to end solution. Right at the start, where are we and where do we need to head? What do we need to do? What are all the stepping stones to get there? And we measure it along the way to make sure that the results actually come with an outcome that everyone wants.
It's a good model, Mark, for many business owners, actually, because how many times do you and I come across companies and they're desperate for staff, but they'll just grab anybody and throw them out there and say, there's the job. No induction, but more importantly, they lack the systems and processes internally to be able to do that properly and to induct people and to train them and then to follow up on the training and check the competency levels, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And to have a training program is not easy to write.
It certainly is.
People think you can I'll just put it together. It's not that easy.
And there's a lot of, people are under time pressure and they have to do what they have to do, but quite often, here's the manual, read it, or here's the e-learning, complete it, and we've ticked off our compliance. And while the compliance might be ticked off in a box, the results are not there. And so, when I work with anybody who's saying, I just need a workshop or I just need training, I want to ask a lot of questions. It's like, what are your gaps and what do you actually need to do? Because if we don't know what those are, that training workshop's going to be a waste of your money. So you need to really unpack what the needs are. And one of the conversations I was having with a colleague this morning was about how an organisation had stuff on the job that needed to be done and it wasn't being done correctly and people were leaving. And it turned out that it was simply because they had old procedures, the procedures weren't available, the people who knew how to do the job weren't available to help the people on the floor. And when we unpacked all of that, the solution was much quicker and easier and less cost than creating a whole e-learning package or creating a new book. So it really is about understanding what the problem is and helping people to come to a solution that works.
So how much of your work's e-learning?
Business, I thought for sure there'll be heaps of need in the e-learning space because digital accessibility is a real gap. Some of my work is, and don't get me wrong, some people actually come to me with broken e-learning saying, please fix it because, I've got someone who's blind and they can't use this. So I do that. But majority of my work tends to be blended programs. So it's never one thing. It's usually a whole lot of things. It might be job aids and maybe a little video here or there, and it might be a whole lot of solutions that contribute. And maybe it's helping managers with the right questions to ask their teams. It can be all sorts of things.
So if you're putting a learning program together and it involves video, and how do you do all that?
It's
Paint
not
a
all
picture.
just me.
Yep.
So we do an analysis first, what needs to happen. And when it's a realisation, we know what the obvious solution is, then I will reach out to people who are specialists in what they do to help to create it. Usually organisations will have a central place that they keep their knowledge source, and we like to use existing systems because there's no point creating an extra system and making more mess for an organisation, especially when everyone's time poor. So if they've already got an existing platform, we'll work with it and make sure that everything that's created is as seamless as possible for the people who are going to use it.
See, Mark, I made a comment to Lyndal the other day when we sat down and had a coffee about, you and I are both directors of other companies or not-for-profits and all this. And one of the things that scares the daylights out of me, being on a board, is in workplace safety, of course. And and the laws change, so you're liable. But how do you, as a director, know that the trainings that if an accident happens or an incident happens, you come in and you can prove that you've done the training, you've done the induction, you've done everything else. And a lot of private business owners don't have any of that documented or don't have a learning process. And that's just as important as the work you're doing with people with disabilities, etc.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And there's certainly work that can be done in that space, and it's certainly something that I could help people with if they needed it.
So how do you adapt a learning programs, for instance, that handles somebody that's blind or someone that's got a disability? What's the things you do?
There are lots of things, but I guess one simple thing to call out, and it's good to call it out on this podcast as a general awareness thing. In Australia, we're less aware. In Europe, in Canada, in the US and the UK, people are right across it because their legislation is stronger. But people who use assistive technology to access the internet through the web, they need to have their websites compliant with web content accessibility guidelines. They're an international standard. They've been adopted by our own laws as well, although it's not as clear but it hasn't been as rampant as, say, in other countries. But what it essentially means is not just looking at what you're seeing as an individual on the screen, but making sure that people can navigate it as well. And also looking at the contrasts of the colours, so people who've got poor vision can see it, and the size of the text and all those types of things that we might take for granted. But, there's so much of a population who are ageing, losing their eyesight gradually or the quality of. There are a lot of people who don't have the dexterity with their fingers, so they can't use a mouse. So how do they navigate a website without a mouse? They'll use a keyboard. And if the keyboard can't be used to access everything on that website, it suddenly becomes a blockout.
Well, you mentioned something to me the other day about someone's colourblind. And if they're doing an online instruction course and it's dependent on the colours, how does that work?
It doesn't. And that's why it's important.
So how do you adjust for that? How do you?
There are really good guidelines. There's actually a colour contrast checker that you can just look up, just Google that, and you can use the little eyedropper tool on your website and eyedrop the foreground colour and the background colour in. It will tell you if it's a good enough contrast or not. They can tell you if somebody who's red-green colourblind, for instance, would have trouble with it. You check for all those things. You don't even have to know what it's checking for. You just put the colours in and it will tell you. But that's a really good starting point.
Can you excuse my ignorance in this, but people listening might be thinking the same thing. So if I've got a website and my colours are red and green, that's my branding. So someone red and green is going to struggle to read it. Is there a way of filtering it so that it can be read? Is there ways of...
Yes, there is, and probably the best way is by having good branding style guidelines for your business. So if your colours are predominantly red and green, you can still have them, but the way they're presented can be done creatively. So you might have, if it's deep green, you might have the deep green with a white background, and the red can be part of that. So you have those contrasts in between so that it makes them more easily visible.
Oh, okay.
There's an interesting point there, Mark, is that people listening to this who are involved in building websites, for instance, should be talking to someone like Lyndal. In fact, I said to her the other day, you should be talking to a couple of our podcasts and a couple of others we know around Geelong, because I would venture to say quite a few of them have no idea.
It's you're right. There are not as many as there should be people who understand the web content guidelines. Yeah. And I mean, it's not like a deliberate oversight. I guess it's not been as widely known in this country because we've not had the government enforcement of it as much. But I would say, though, if anybody does have a website where it has a presence in the EU, for instance, that they've only got till next year to fix it. Otherwise, it'll be shut down. And that's simply because their laws they've been brought into a standard that they're saying, you're actually, if you can't meet this standard, you're not meeting the needs of all the people, and we don't want it.
Well, that's another thing, Mark. We operate this podcast under the moniker of SME advisory, but it's not small or medium enterprise. It's actually subject matter experts.
Yeah.
And here we are. We've got a subject matter expert today.
That's interesting. Very interesting.
Yes.
So, future of your business, where do you see yourself going?
Yeah, well, I'm super keen to be a thought leader in the learning inclusion space. So I'm still incredibly passionate about learning. Obviously, this digital accessibility thing is part of it, but I really want to be the learning designer of choice for inclusion.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Working on that.
I've learned a lot today, Bill.
Well, haven't we, from all three podcasts?
From all three
But
podcasts.
here with Lyndal, as I was fascinating, this is a subject I know nothing about. I know how important it is, though, and so that's why it's really good to have you here to explain all this. And people listening to it, they should be getting in touch.
And how do they do that, Lyndal? How do they get in touch with you?
Well, they can get in touch with me directly through LinkedIn, and I love to connect with people on LinkedIn, so please do that if you'd like to. But I also have a website, so that's lblearningsolutions.com.
Fantastic. So thank you, Lyndal. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Lyndal, and thank you for coming to our workshop the other day, by the way. And I think you might be doing a SWOT analysis now after that.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.